Ladies and gentlemen, your host, Shirtman Worldwide.
Good evening and welcome to this, the TooFatLardies Oddcast. It's great to be back again as we record from another plane, from an existential dimension, the dimension of the internet still in lockdown. And tonight I'm joined by the Captain Kirk and Mr. Spock of Wargaming, Nick Skinner and Richard Kark. Gentlemen, how are you both?
I'm living long and prospering, thank you, Sydney.
Oh, that's good.
Beam me up, Sydney, beam me up. I've had enough of this. I've had enough of this lockdown now. It's not funny anymore.
Well, we have a special small celebration today because it is, as we are recording this, the evening of July the 4th, I think it is. And this is the date on which pubs are opening again in the United Kingdom. So it says something that we're all sitting here and welcoming each other to another Oddcast.
I don't think I want to go to the pub at the moment. I don't think the pub is quite the pub that we remember.
No, I agree. And I'm a man who has occasionally visited and enjoyed public houses, but I don't fancy it at the moment.
But it is Independence Day as well, Sydney, of course, for our friends who are listening on the other side of the pond.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy Independence Day to all our friends in the United States of America.
And I wonder how they're marking this. They're probably marking this by large barbecues and firework displays and other things that Americans do, which they're noted for. So opening possibly a can of cold beer.
A heavily hopped bottle of IPA. They do like their hops over there.
They like their IPA. That beer, actually, I do like American beer, I've got to say. But
I don't.
We digress.
I don't. I can't deal with all those hops.
Really?
No, awful, terrible.
My favourite beer is an American beer. But I can't really get it anymore over here, and it's Michelot, which used to be absolutely gorgeous. Used to have a lot of that in the 90s and early 2000s. And they sort of kind of stopped making it over here under license, and it is a great shame. So I used to love that. Anyway, rather than talking about beer and fireworks and our American cousins and pubs, what else have we got to talk about? Well, I think one big thing happening over the last couple of weeks has been the launch of Infamy, Rich. I mean, was that possibly the largest amount of boxes you've ever lifted in a day?
Well, fortunately, I didn't have to lift them all in a day. So far, we've done it in 4 deliveries, and there's still a 5th one to get, and maybe a 6th, depending on how much I can fit in the car. But yeah, huge launch, biggest launch we've ever had, which was fabulous. And I think we took a bit of a chance launching, with everything that's happened with lockdown and everything, because a lot of people are thinking, well, when am I going to get a game? But I think a lot of people have found it interesting to follow the process as we've been in lockdown and see me painting things and playing games and getting the rules ready. And it's, the number of people who are really being enthusiastic about it at the moment is brilliant, really over the moon.
And we know that that's not just in this country, but all around the world. And we've got some evidence for that a little bit later when we talk about Virtual Lard, which has been another fantastic event run by Jeremy Short, but with a lot of other participators. Earlier this month, actually last month, in fact, on the 20th of June, which is a really great event, which I know both of you did. We're going to talk about that later. But that was certainly a highlight of the last month since the last podcast, I think, Nick.
Yeah, it was. It was one of those events that actually kind of came out of nowhere, really. It wasn't, hugely in the planning, I don't think. But he really put together something that was top-notch at the end of it, and he's going to tell us all about it later on. Because, of course, at the moment, we're all missing our conventions and shows and thinking of weekends, when we're sitting at home when we should have been somewhere else. So it was lovely to be able to connect up to people. And it also coincided with a scorching hot weekend in the UK, which I think helped some of us empty the fridge quicker than we might otherwise have done. So he's going to tell us about that later.
Fantastic. That's really great. So we've got Infamy, the launch out of the way. We've got Virtual Lard done. What's next on the agenda? I mean, what else are we going to be working on, hopefully throughout the rest of them? Hopefully a very short lockdown period remaining, but if it's longer than that, what have we got? I mean, I was thinking, just chatting to you the other day, Rich, that you could say some things about maybe Infamy 2. And Nick, what about Arnhem?
Yeah. Shall I jump in there first of all? Because we've got a few other things before Infamy 2. We've got the Far East Handbook for Chain of Command, which is now going to go, is now at layout stage. And we have, that's already been started. And I just need to finish that off. And we've also got O Group by Dave Brown from our sister company, Rise Press, which is very much getting to the point now where it's going to lay out, excuse me, it's going to lay out next week. So we've got lots of ships pulling in the harbour at the same time. Infamy, of course, is a set of rules that's going to be in 3 parts. Part 2 is something that I'm really about to embark on. I'm actually having this week kind of getting up to date on everything, you know, that with the launch like we've had, things tend to slip a little bit in terms of I've got to do my VAT return and exciting things like that. So I've got that this week, and then next week I'm going to have a week off, and I've got a big pile of books to start reading for Infamy Part 2. We're looking there at slave revolts, we're looking at Carthage, the Punic Wars, we're looking at Greeks, we're looking at North Africans, Numidians, and who knows where else that's going to take us, but very much Rome's civil wars as well. So that's going to be really exciting, yeah, and I've been doing a lot of stuff in the workshop to do with that, but I'll tell you about that when we get there. Now, Nicholas, tell us about your imaginary friend, Arnhem.
My imaginary friend Arnhem. Well, it's still there. It's not imaginary. It really exists. But I guess it's, you know, I've not made the pace I wanted to make with it in the last 6 months, really. And of course, lockdown hasn't helped that at all. But I've been working lately on I've had to rethink some of the work we're doing around the 101st Airborne, around the early actions that they're involved with, because I was running through what I had and I just thought this wasn't quite right. So I've had to retweak that and added something else extra in on the around an encounter there on the northern outskirts of Eindhoven at I think called Flockhaven, which is just north of Eindhoven. It's now part of a new industrial estate and a brand new road, I think. But there's some interesting little actions around there that we're going to build in. So it's moving. It's still moving. It's not ready yet, but it's on its way. I don't know. I can't say any more than that. I mean, it's going to need some input from Rich to get it over the line, obviously, because it's going to end up, you know, it's been a TFL flag product, and he's still got work to do around the British aspect of what we're going to push out early in the supplement around Wolfhazy, etc. But it is still coming. I'm really keen to keep moving with it. So if you're waiting for it, waiting. It's a bit like 30 Core. It is coming. It is on the way. It's just a bit later than it will be.
Good analogy. Very good. Very good.
Do you think it's been a bigger project than you ever thought at the start? I mean, I remember when we first talked about you doing stuff relating to Arnhem. We always thought when we talked about it in the car that it was going to be a big project. It seems to have grown as you've understood the actions and the interrelationship with the different actions more.
Yes, it's grown because the more I read, the more I find, and the more I find, the more I think we can gain that, or you know, that part of it isn't quite the way we thought it was. It's really important to us that it's got a strong, you know, basis on history. Try to get things as accurate as we can, obviously, and that takes time. And most of that research, you know, there's always new books coming on the market. And in fact, I'm waiting on one to drop through my letterbox today about Arnhem, and I'm going to look at that, you know, and you never know, it's going to throw something else, whether it's going to throw something else out there for us to look at. It has grown hugely. I mean, the number of potential scenarios that could fit in it initially meant that we suddenly realized that it had to go from being one supplement to being a number of supplements. And and that is still very much the case. So as we said before, the first part of it, we think, will be the actions around Wolfhazer, the British landings on the 17th of September. It will be the 101st actions of the 17th and 18th of September around Son and Best and St Ernan and Vagel, and it will be the Irish Guards and colleagues pushing north up the road to Valkenswaard. So that in itself, probably going to be how many are in there? That's probably 18 scenarios in there, plus associated bits and pieces around how the campaign works, etc. So it's chunky. It is chunky, and it is bigger than we thought it would be when we first opened the box.
But better, I think. We've had a lot of conversations.
Oh, for sure, yeah.
We've had a lot of conversations as you've gone through this, and it would be very easy just to churn something out and go, there we go, that's it, and make up what you don't know. But I mean, I have to take my hat off to you. You've gone the extra mile, and then another 10 miles on top in terms of doing the research and buying the books and actually finding out everything that you possibly can. So I hope people will recognise the fact that when it arrives, it's going to be possibly one of the most comprehensive wargaming guides to Operation Market Garden as a whole.
And I think the key thing for me is that it's got to have the feel of Market Garden as well, which is really difficult, because if you've got a number of actions taking place over a 70-mile corridor of a 70-mile corridor of action, and some of these are simultaneous. So you've got fighting in Arnhem on the 17th of September. You've got fighting at Valkenswaard or south of Valkenswaard on that same day, and it's connecting those actions together so that one has meaning against the other one, in a way that allows a campaign to unfold. So we're hoping very much that will work nicely. I'm really pleased with the way it looks at the moment, and we're just plugging in, as I say, a few bits around the 101st, and getting there.
Well, let's take those thoughts about plugging things together and interrelating things, and let's possibly do a connected walk towards the workshop, where I know we've been looking at different sorts of ways to connect up inspiration with physical items.
Did you say a collective walk or a connective walk?
Could be either. Collective and connected walk.
How would we do that?
He's talking rubbish. He's just talking gibberish.
This is in the script.
It's not on the bloody script. What a script, you lying git? There isn't a script.
I'm looking at it now. It's just above the thing which says, quote, waffle, unquote.
Well, that is the script. That genuinely is the script.
Hold this for a game of soldiers. We're off to the workshop. And here we are in the workshop, connected and collected together again. And I think we're going to start with you, Nick, because I know you've got some really good things in the workshop, which are relating to all sorts of stuff that you've been doing.
Yeah, I bet. And it's got a bit of a Market Garden theme to it, because the life seems to have that for me at the moment. I'm caught in lockdown in Market Garden, so I've been doing some stuff. One of the things I've been doing, I want to show you this. You may have seen this on Twitter, is I've been doing some work on some Dutch resistance teams. So one of the things you better do in the Arnhem supplement is have a support option, if you're Americans, is to have some Dutch resistance guys to help you out. And every resistance team needs its own truck, doesn't it? So here we are. I'll show this to the guys on camera, and for you at home, you can imagine what a truck looks like. And it's a sort of, imagine a 1940s truck.
Removal wagon, isn't it, really?
It's a removal van. Yeah, it is. Well, actually, you say it's a removal van. It's the kind of van that a celebrity clog maker would have. So it's removal van sized, because he ships very large quantities of clogs around the cut. And of course, the Germans have not commandeered his vehicle because it's such an essential industry. So we've got Oud Jasper, the celebrity clog maker of Eindhoven, who of course is involved in the underground network. So what that is it's an old, I think it's a Corgi, is it? An old Corgi 150th removal truck, which I've just done a bit of work on to make it look like old Jasper's celebrity clockmaker truck. And it's what I did was I actually printed out. It's got script down the side, Jasper, in like a nice handwritten font, which I printed out and PVA'd on, and then painted up the rest of the truck. So I'm really pleased with that. It's going to park down the side of an alley somewhere, and jumping out of that will be these dudes in their sort of blue overalls and orange armbands. Yeah. So we've got some, I think these are black tree miniatures that I've had for years, but are painted up as Dutch resistance guys. I think they're supposed to be French resistance. So I've taken out the ones which look obviously French, and put the armband on them using a bit of green stuff. So I'm really pleased with those. I've got a nice little group of those. A lovely guy here, look, running. I don't even see this guy. He's running, carrying an MG.
Oh, that's cool.
34.
So I think he's a black tree figure. I'm not entirely sure because he was in my bits box. So we've got been doing those, been doing some resistance fights. Also been doing some guys for the 101 Airborne for some photos that we're trying to put in the supplement. And of course, the reason for that is that when you're in lockdown, you can't use your mate's figures. So I've had to paint up some for that. So I've got some here. These are actually Wargames paratroopers. I don't know if you can see them there. Yeah. And of course, Market Garden uniform. So I've added, I don't know if you can see that, I've added a green stuff armband to his arm there, because they had that armband in Market Garden, certainly on the early days before they took it away and threw it in the ditch. And of course at Market Garden they're also wearing the different uniform that they didn't wear at D-Day. They had a different uniform but a slightly different colour. So of course if you're going to be technical about it, you'd have different Yanks from Market Garden than the ones that you would use for Arnhem, but I think for D-Day, but I think mostly get away with it. And I've been using on that something which I'm going to put forward as the best bit of the bench. Do you want to know what it is now, Sydney, or do you want me to hold it back until we talk about the best bit on the bench?
I think we can find out a little bit about it now, and then we can gather all our best bits together later.
Okay. Well, I've been so shading is an important way that we paint our figures these days, isn't it? So I was looking at shading. I normally use Vallejo washes, and I thought I wanted something that would be a bit better for the American uniform, green, that kind of kept the colour closer to what I wanted it to be. I had a go actually with using the Army Painter tones. I actually got some strong tone, but actually it was so strong that they came out looking like they'd been dipped in Willy Wonka's chocolate factory for 2 days, and they came out sort of mud brown and much muddier and browner than I would have wanted. Whether that's because I didn't mix it right or because I didn't dip it right or whatever, I don't know. But it's just a really strong colour. So I wanted something else that was not quite a green wash, but something that was that wasn't brown either. And so I've chanced upon, I think somebody on YouTube was using this to paint some figures. Here it is, a Army Painter military shader, it's called. So it's in a bottle. What do you call it? A dropper bottle. Mm-hmm. So it's in a dropper bottle. However big they are, 18 mils, whatever it is, I don't know. And it's like a dark green, like a grass green wash. So it's not brown, and it's not bright green like some of the Citadel washes are. It's a really nice uniform, World War II uniform wash. And I've actually washed some American uniforms. I've even washed some German uniforms in this, and they just come out looking really nice. It's whereas the brown can be a bit, it can be a bit over the top. This is a really nice subtle wash that sits beautifully in the recesses of the figure. And I'm putting it forward to my best bit on the bench, which is the Army Painter Quick Shade Military Shader. So that's the one from me.
And that will dry a lot quicker than the dip, because the dip is chemical based, whereas that's water based.
See, this is the thing with dip. What you didn't tell me with the dip was that it's going to take 2 days for the bloody things to dry. I mean, I dipped them and then I thought, I left it overnight. I went back in the morning and I thought, oh, that's going to be great. And I picked it up and it was still wet.
And if you paint over it before it's dry, all the paint wrinkles up because the moisture is sort of trapped behind it or whatever it does. So once you're committed to it, you really are committed to it.
Sid?
Yeah, I think we found when we were doing the Saxons way back for Dux Britanniarum, we sort of did them over a week weekend, I think, or 2 weekends. And we used all that army painted dip that you passed on to me, Rich. It's good.
But it's not quite right.
It's not quite right. It's not really very subtle. Whereas you can get the same result, I think, with the washes. Yeah. And you can mix the washes, and you can use one of the other best bits on the bench from a few months ago. You can use that glazed medium from Vallejo to mix in the washes together to get a really smooth consistency. And I think the thing with washing, because it dries quickly, you can put 2 or 3 coats on very quickly. And also you can do different washes for different parts of the figure. You might say, well, that's getting a bit too complicated. I can accept that. But I think the thing with the Army Painter strong tone dip, even if you're painting it on, it's kind of a once over, and it brings the figure together, and it's certainly hard wearing. It does take a long time to dry, and it's not as subtle.
Yeah, and what you said there, Sid, about using different washes on different parts of the figure is exactly the way I like to paint. So actually, I think, while I've got this big tub of strong tone, and I've used it for one figure, I don't think I'm ever going to use it again on any figures, because it's just not the way I like to use it. So, and I've used, on these figures, for instance, I've done the rucksacks have a different wash on them than the uniforms have on them, because on the rucksack I use like it's a Citadel sort of dark flesh wash or something, and the uniform is green. So I like having the 2 washes. I like being subtle in the way that they're applied. I don't necessarily like the big dips. So I don't really know why I went for the big dip. I think it's because I was in lockdown and I was bored, and I thought, well, let's give this a go and see if it works. And I don't think it's for me. Isn't it funny how things just don't suit your style?
I'll have it off you, because I would use it, and I find it good for certain things, but I must admit, I've stopped using Army Painter dips and started using, well, we talked about it before, but it's still on my desk, Ronseal interior varnish. This is an antique pine, which gives a very light, sort of brownish tint to it. And the good thing about the Ronseal range is you can get different, there's lots more gradations in terms of colours. So rather than just having soft tone, strong tone and dark tone, you've got pine, you've got oak, you've got blah-de-blah. And as long as you know your arboretums, you can work it out. But So, and the other advantage of Ronseal, sorry, just quickly, is that it's water-based, so it dries a lot quicker than the chemical-based Army Painter.
So I was just going to finish off really, by saying that, I'm still in World War II. I'm still very much in World War II, and I'm still very much heads down in painting stuff that's around Market Garden as well. Some of them for photographs of hopefully what we put in the finished product at the end of it. So that's me really. That's what I've been up to. Haven't had a chance to do much else in terms of any other gaming or much really. We're going to talk about Virtual Lard, I know. But in terms of the workbench, I'm done. What you guys been up to?
Yeah, Grabbers, what about you, mate?
Well, I've been doing some building. I've been carrying on painting my 17th century stuff, but I fancied a bit of a change. I think one of the things we've talked about through lockdown is doing things which are varied, and also trying to get inspiration from places. And lockdown's a strange time, because at certain points of lockdown, you think, well, I'm going to get all these different things done, which I've been lined up for ages. And at other times you think, I just can't be bothered with anything. I'm just going to spend the time with either my television or the wife and the kids or whatever it is. But one of the things that I'd had the idea of since we were last in Antwerp was doing some properly designed 17th century buildings for my Spanish Netherlands, Flanders sort of project. So I set about it by bringing together some of the different images that we took when we were going around places in Antwerp and other places in Flanders. You can see there, I sort of put together kind of like a mood board on PowerPoint. And I took from that the dimensions for various buildings that I scratch built. So I tried to make the footprint quite small. So that's something that we've all talked about on the Oddcast before. So these are both on 6 inches by 6 inches or 6 inches by 5 inches. And they're two sort of...
It's always 6 inches.
Always 6 inches. 2 Flemish 17th century buildings, and I tried to get them to look as much like the images from the art galleries and the sort of places that we went when we were last in Antwerp, trying to really accentuate things which looked Flemish from the view of being 3 feet away. So they're probably not precisely the exact scale that the real things would have been, because it's that sort of wargaming height, scale, contrast. But I felt that I tried to get the sloping roofs, tried to get the steeped gables, also tried to get the effect with thatching for rural buildings rather than slate, which you often see on MDF kits. Tried to get the thin sort of Flemish windows, which are really common in all the art of the period, and really tried to get something which looked like what we thought we should be seeing, as opposed to absolutely the precise replica that we might want to see if we're making a model kit of a tank.
So, and is that because you scratch built it because there's nothing available, Sid, or because you wanted a particular look?
It's a bit of both, really. I really wanted to have something in the terrain which looked Flemish, which looked 17th century-ish, and which I could say, pointing to something which we saw as being a Flemish painting from Antwerp that was, you know, very set within that period. And there isn't really anything around. A bit like you found when you were doing Arnhem, a lot of the buildings for the Low Countries are really based on the sort of buildings that you see in Amsterdam. Well, that's not common in all of the sort of Spanish Netherlands and northern France. It'd be a very different look when you look at the art of the period from what was being built in Amsterdam in the late 18th century. So there wasn't really anything available. There were things which were similar, but they just didn't look right. And often they were with slate and not with thatch. So putting it all together and scratch building, I thought that was quite a fun project to do. And again, it was one of those things that I wanted to do for about a year, but hadn't really had the time. And it just filled in a weekend. And once, like a lot of the things that we've talked about over the last few months, once you did it, you just wanted to, well, I just wanted to do more. So I ended up doing 2. I've got a 3rd on the go. And really for any sort of game which is based on a 6x4 table, yeah, 3 buildings is more than enough as a small village for a skirmish type game, or even a larger game if you're scaling up.
Can I just say that kind of reminds me, looking at that, of the old Charles Grant buildings, which used to have the height, but the footprint was relatively small. And I think you've kind of replicated that approach. It gives you a stylized view without too much sprawl across the table, doesn't it?
That's right.
I really like that. That isn't a criticism. I love that Charles Grant, old-fashioned Charles Grant look of those very stylized buildings, which had a kind of toy soldier feel. I mean, yours are more the feel of the great Flemish artists of the period, but the footprint is a lot smaller.
Yeah, and thank you. And a big shout out to young Michael Scott, who we met in Musselburgh last year, whose small oratory church for the Dark Age Dutch Britanniarum game was absolutely a fantastic example of a really small footprint on the table, but which perfectly set the theme for the entire game. And Michael was kind enough to talk about that with us and the kits that he produces, and very, very kindly sort of went back and got us a couple of samples which we brought to take back with us. But Michael really inspired the idea that you could do a lot with a very small footprint. And I think we'd also played in games around about the same time where possibly there was a large footprint of a building and that dominated the skirmish game, which is absolutely fine for a skirmish game. But if you've got a game which is based on perhaps companies or larger formations like battalions, with a large footprint, you're really definitely saying on that scale that this is a significant village or a small town. Whereas often what you're really trying to reflect in a location like Flanders is a lot of those, you know, large farms or small villages or fortified locations which sort of dot around the Flemish countryside, you know, well past Waterloo. And you can see them today as you're on the road, as we have been driving towards Antwerp every year. Yeah,
very much so. As you drive up that coastal strip, you see those farms, don't you, that are quintessentially reflective of that region.
It's interesting, isn't it? Sid, I think you know, they look lovely, those buildings, and I hope you can share some photos on Twitter or something so people can see what you've done there. What are they made from? Are they foam board?
Yeah, they are. It's an MDF base, and then it's just foam board. Which I just glue together. The roofs, I'll do the post on the blog. The roofs were simple to do for one and complicated for the other. So I wanted to get a concave roof, which is very much like the type that you see in the paintings, and that was a bit of a pain having to bend it. And then there's a lot of mini-putt, which I used for the thatching, which is horrible old type of...
It is horrible.
Disgusting putty. It really is horrible to work with, but it gives a really good, really firm sort of effect. And you can sculpt it, and once it's on, I mean, it is really, really rock hard. I mean, if you don't wear your Reading ring when you're doing that, if you get milliput on that, you'll be scraping that off for goodness knows how long. But it's a really good tool to use, but it's an absolute beast to prepare and put on. But yeah, and it's just foam board, and then with a PVA and polyfiller wash. So really using very little polyfiller, but lots of PVA, and just wash the buildings around about 5 or 6 times to give the foam board real rigidity.
That's really, they look really good as well. Excellent. So you've been, Rich, whilst he's been scraping off his ring, what have you been doing?
Well, I've been, funnily enough, I've been building some buildings. Looking ahead to Infamy Part 2, I've decided that I'm going to be putting a lot. We're obviously moving into the land of the more civilized folk. So we're going into the Iberian Peninsula, and we're going around the Mediterranean Rim. So I've decided that I was going to get together a Roman town to do some Roman street fighting. Well, I actually thought all the component parts could be used for small settlements or whatever. And that could be really relevant for things like Roman Civil War or slave revolts. But I also really like the idea of doing a Roman town fight, such as in Cremona in AD 69, where you've got the forces of Vitellius against the forces of Otho, meeting and having a fight in the streets there. I just thought could look fantastic. And also I've been doing some sort of North African buildings for Carthage and Carthaginian things, because I really like the idea of doing the ultimate Roman Carthaginian fight in Carthage itself, where they're fighting from rooftop to rooftop with boards across the gaps in between. So I've been really cracking on with lots of MDF and PVA. Some really super buildings out there. I've been using buildings from, for the Roman stuff, using buildings from war bases, using buildings from Sarissa, and another company who I can't remember. I'm just going to go and have a look, because the box is over here.
I noticed while you're doing that, Rich, I just noticed that war bases are back to full trading now after putting their machinery over to producing protective personal equipment during the coronavirus incident. They're now gone back to work properly. So hats off to them from us for doing what they did to keep us all safe. Well done, guys.
Empires at War is the other one.
Right.
They sell a lot on eBay, and they're very nice, very impressed with them. They do a kind of MDF roof, but with a sort of lightweight plastic tiling system, where the tiling sheet is cut to shape, and you apply that and glue that on, and it does give a really really nice look to it. The Sarissa ones, I'm finding that I'm having to re-roof, because they use a lot of lightweight cardboard for their roofs, and for me, I'm finding that a little bit too flimsy. Again, if I was just gaming at home, I don't think it would be an issue, but it's because we go around so many shows with this kit, and I'm specifically building this Roman city to take to a Tactica in Hamburg next year. So it's going to have to be robust, because it's going to be in a car zooming across Europe. So I've been using the Wills Pantile tiles for that. Now, I know the Romans didn't use Pantile tiles, but their tiling system looks remarkably similar to it from a distance. So I kind of went, oh, well, I don't really care. And that does get a nice effect. So that's been good. But the company that I've been really impressed with, which again was on eBay, is a company called Game Cult. and they do what they call desert buildings. And they do they do several sets, but I bought sets A, B, and C. And they're those variable height flat roof buildings where some of them are 1 story, some of them 2, some of them 3. So you get that really nice, almost biblical skyline, which I think looks really good. So I've been cracking on with them. That's been my main preoccupation. I'm actually at that really frustrating stage where I want to buy a Carthaginian army and get painting it, but I haven't done the research yet. So I'm not just going to fly off and go, those figures look nice, I want 10 of them, and they look nice, I want 10 of them. I'm actually going to do the research and then see see what I do need. Yeah. So there's going to be several new armies. I mean, I've already painted a load of Spanish stuff. I want to get some Lusitanians. I'm not quite sure how different I need to be for them, so that's going to involve some more research over in Portugal. I want to get a Numidian army. And I want to get, because they've got some fairly interesting troop types, the Numidians, including their own sort of version of the Legion, which are quite interesting. And obviously I want to do Carthage and then head over towards Greece as well. So lots of things that I'm dying to get off the lease and do, but I've got a load of research to do first, so I just thought I'd start with buildings.
Well, that sounds terrific. Well, I think, that's probably the roundup for the workshop. But does that mean that your shading system...
I didn't see any competitors out there. No competition.
I think it's difficult for me to say.
Hold on. I'm not going to put this forward as the best bit on the bench, but you have reminded me to say something that's important. The Game Cult MDF buildings, North Africa, are really good because they are in 3mm MDF. 2mm MDF does not look thick enough to me, and it would mean that I have to put a lot of effort getting some kind of way of thickening that wall up and making it more like 4mm. But 3mm MDF is just thick enough to not have to bother with all that nonsense. So I'm really pleased with the way they've come straight out of the box and onto the table. But I don't think that competes with Nick's really spanky new military shader, because I've never heard of that. I don't think.
Yeah. Well, I don't think it is new, but it is new to me. So it's the Army Painter Quick Shade military shader. I would say whatever nationality you're painting in moderns. So if you're painting anything that's 1900 onward, and even if you're painting anything that's that's got a kind of earth shade to it, it would be a fantastic wash to have a go at.
Okay, that's interesting.
That looks really good. Well done. Well, we've talked about what we've been making, what we've been building, what we've been painting, but we've also been doing a bit of gaming. And recently, we had the opportunity to take part in Virtual Lard, which was an online Lardy Games Day. And I think all 3 of us took part in that, which was on the 20th of June. And I think we all had a fantastic time. And we all, I think, played in the games and enjoyed the after-game entertainment. Nick, do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
I can do. Yes, and in fact, we spoke to Jeremy Short, who was the man behind it, and he told us everything. We took him down to the dungeons, put him in chains, and put him through all various forms of torture, and he soon opened up. Shall we listen to what he had to say?
Sydney Roundward. He's got red trousers.
And we're back. And we've got a very special guest on the Oddcast at this point. It's our very good friend, hot from the north of England, via South Africa. We've got Jeremy Short, who's with us, who hosted, organised and arranged Virtual Lard a little bit earlier in June. And that was something that myself, Rich and Nick all joined. And we all thought it was a fantastic experience. So, Jeremy, we thought we'd have you here to chat a bit more about it and how you got the idea.
Thank you. Hi, guys. Thank you for having me on the show.
Hello, Governor.
Hey, Nick.
Oh, yeah, the Governor. The Governor. Hello, Jeremy. How are you? Nice to see you.
I'm all right. Thanks, Rich.
So tell us about Virtual Lard then, old chap. Where did the idea come from for that?
was actually a couple of things all came together. Basically, one of the side effects of lockdown was everybody was missing their favorite shows, fantastic Lardy weekends, their club games. And there was a sense of sort of disappointment especially on Twitter, around missing OML 8 and Deep Fried Lard. And whilst all this was going on, I was following with quite a lot of interest John Savage's Infamy games that he was hosting over Zoom. So the thought occurred to me, well, why don't we take a couple of these Zoom games, put them all together and see if we could do a Lardy Day. So I approached John Savage and Charlie Walker and bounced the idea off them. And they were really, really keen, and they decided they would put 2 games forward. And with my game, I thought, well, 3 games, there's enough critical mass there. So I tentatively put it out to Twitter and a couple of the Facebook Lardy pages, and the response was immense. Before I knew it, I had 7 sold out games with an offer to run an 8th. Wow. And that's really where it all came from. The response from the Lardy community was absolutely fantastic.
So we should perhaps try and say what Virtual Lard was for those that weren't involved with it. So how can I explain it? I guess it was a games day with people playing war games, but instead of going to a convention hall to do it, you directed the game from your armchair while somebody else had a table set up and they moved the figures for you over Zoom. Is that right? Can you put it any more clearly than that, Jeremy?
Yeah, so what really happens is you have a games organizer and you have the players. So the games organizer will set up a full table with all the terrain, has both sides out on the table, develops the scenario. He then sets up a camera, whether it be a laptop or a tablet or a mobile phone or even a video camera, on the short edge of the table, looking down the length of the table. He then uses a platform such as Zoom or Discord. Zoom is the most popular one because it's got a nice function that if you've got 2v2, the people on the same side can have private chats to discuss strategy. But really, you can use whichever hosting platform you like. So once this camera is set up, he creates a Zoom session or Meet session, whichever he likes, and the camera then replaces what you would normally see as his face in a normal meeting.
So you players are table, yeah.
Correct, yes. Then players are sent the Zoom link, they sign up and they enter, and when they log in, they can see the main view of the table and they can see each other. What a lot of us do, it's not necessary, but it does add another dimension to the game, is having something like a mobile phone as a roving or a mobile camera. This then signs into Zoom as another user. So you would have, say, your 4 users across the top and another view of the table. What's great about this is, although you can see the table as a whole, you sometimes want to see a certain portion of the table or perhaps a dice roll or a certain combat or something, and the organizer can then take the camera and move it up and focus on that particular aspect of the table with the players just toggling in between the two. The rest is really just like a standard war game, except you're not doing any of the heavy lifting. You tell the games organizer where you would like your figures to move. He asks you to roll some dice. You then tell everybody what you've rolled. You apply whatever results. And from there on, it's exactly a normal game.
It was a very interesting day, and you ran it through Discord, so that the everybody who was running a game was invited to a Discord channel. Because that was like the convention hall, wasn't it, in which all these games took place? How did that work?
Correct. So one of the things about hosting a virtual Lardy Games Day is it has a lot more moving parts than a regular Lardy Games Day. One of the biggest things you have to keep pushing is communication. So I thought the best way to do that was to create a Discord channel and invite all the organizers and all the players onto that. And one of the advantages advantages of Discord is you can create channels. So I created a channel for each of the games being hosted, and I assigned only the players that were playing that game to those channels. So that allowed the organizers to have a private conversation with the players without everybody else chipping in and getting involved, telling them what they need to do, how it's going to work, how to test their technology just to make sure they can enjoy the game, and setting up pre-game meetings just to run through a couple of things, etc., which worked really, really well. We also then had a couple of group chat channels where the guys could just shoot the breeze, and yeah, it proved to be really popular.
Mm-hmm.
What about the pub? That was a good bit.
Yeah,
I was gonna build up to the pub.
well,
so, go on then. Tell us about the pub. Go on, humour him. Tell him about the pub.
so no Lardy Games Day is a Lardy Games Day without a trip to the pub afterwards. I mean, you can't go to Lardy Games Day without sitting in the pub and hearing Rich sing. So I thought,
if only.
so I thought I'd put on a virtual pub and see how it went. So going back to the original Discord channel where all the communication took place, I created a number of channels that were both audio and video. And these essentially became tables in a pub. And I named each of the tables after a couple of famous battles and limited the number of people at a table to roughly 6 or 8, purely so that you didn't overload the broadband requirements for that channel and everybody could have a chance to chat to each other. And what's nice about the way Discord works is you can see who is at each table and if there's an open space for you. So when you walk into the virtual pub, you can see, oh, Leipzig table, there's a couple of spots open, and Nick's there, let me go and have a chat to him. And it worked quite well. It was nice that people were moving from table to table, chatting to everybody like you would in a normal pub.
Yeah.
It worked really, really well. It got very festive and went on rather late.
Yeah.
It did go on rather late, apparently. I was an early departer, but it went on quite late, I believe, and seemed to be a very successful part of the entire event. So
I didn't so much move from table to table, but I moved from the table to under the table.
Yeah, bizarrely, I got a lot of requests from people saying, look, I can't play on the day, but I'd really just like to come and sit in the pub and have a couple of beers and chat to you guys.
Yeah.
So gave them access to the Discord channel, and that's what they did. It was fantastic.
Yeah, it was good. It was nice. It was nice to have a beer and, with the guys from Bavaria, have a chat with them. You know, really interesting. Get to chat to Dave Churchill, who over in Kansas, who we played several Kriegspiel games with, but I've never even seen before, apart from his sort of little picture on Twitter, which looks nothing like him. So it was just good to have a chat.
And that was one of the key things for me, which was the takeaway, is that we go to Evesham every year, we do OML, or we go to, or you go to Deep Fried Lard, because I've never been to Deep Fried Lard. This was international. You know, there were guys, I checked in on various games throughout the day. There were guys in Bavaria running games that involved guys from America and in the UK. And the international flavour was really fantastic. And I've not... You know, this was the only way you could really appreciate that and explore that. And Sid, you played some games as well. Tell us about what you were doing, Sydney.
Yeah, I played 2 games, and I've got to echo everything that you've talked about, Jeremy. So I played in two games of Ducks. I'm a big fan of Dux Britanniarum. I really enjoy the set of rules, and I think that it produces really good games. So I played your game in the morning, Jeremy, and then Mike Whittaker's game in the afternoon. I was really taken and surprised and impressed by the fact that it didn't take a lot longer than just a normal game over the table. I know that you and me, Richard, talked about this before when you played in one of these games, and you'd suggested that it would take longer, so I was prepared for that. But actually, it didn't take much longer. It was only about half an hour longer to play virtually than it did on the actual table when we play around the table. So I thought that was interesting. I think the second thing which worked really well was you made a virtue of what seemed at first to be a disadvantage. So you can't really communicate with people in quite the same way virtually as you would do around the table, because it's an open channel chat. So everything normal, but it's difficult to sort of really sort of get to sidebar with people on your own side to discuss tactics. But what there is there's a chat function on the Zoom, and we use that in both of the games to talk amongst ourselves as we would at the start of the game, sharing sort of thoughts and going through the game. And that worked really well, that we could confer on each side, but there was still an open chat with the Zoom function for all the different players. And that was one of those things that I'm not sure that would have quite worked as well in person. So it's kind of like there's a few things which you can do with a virtual game, which you might not easily be able to do around the table. Rich?
Yeah, I was going to say, I actually played a game with a guy called Noah down in Australia. And you think, actually, this is something, this is not just a poor substitute for a Lardy Games Day. This is something totally different. This is allowing us to be international. This is, you know, TooFatLardies. You get people coming from Scotland and the north of England. Evesham, you know, you tend to get people more from the south and the west. And you're limited by your locations, whereas this wasn't limited by the locations. It was great to get to game with people who have never gamed with before because they're in totally different locations. Jeremy?
Yeah, that was, I think, the biggest success of it is because we said you don't have to play both games. You can just sign up for one game if you like. Yeah. So the guys from Australia all signed up for the morning game, and the guys from America all signed up for the afternoon game. Yeah. And that really worked well, I think.
Yeah. And what feedback have you had since from those that are involved? Because you were very keen to get some feedback from those that were there. What did they have to say about it?
Yeah, so I put on that Discord channel, I opened up a chat channel and said, look, if we're going to do this again, I need some honest feedback from everybody. If it's crap, tell us it's crap, but tell us why it's crap. Or if it's good, tell us why it's good. If you think things could be done differently, tell us. And by and large, the feedback was very, very popular. Everybody seemed to enjoy it. Had a couple of interesting ones where adding to it, maybe perhaps having somebody do a chat in between the games or between the game and the pub if people want to stay on, different camera techniques, things like that. But by and large, the concept I think is quite sound and everybody enjoyed it. So much that we're going to be doing a second one in a couple of weeks.
Mm-hmm. And is that with the same people, or is it a bigger group, or how's that going to work?
No, much bigger group. So on Wednesday this week, I put out the announcement that we'd be doing another one on the 25th. And I probably had another 20 or 30 people express interest. So I think we're up to about 80 odd people on the Zoom server at the moment.
Bloody hell. That's colossal.
Wow.
I mean, that is colossal.
That's quite a big event.
Yeah.
And I haven't even told you I'm coming, so you can make it 81.
Fair enough.
So that's reaching out to a whole new group of people. Are they names and people that you already knew, or are these a whole lot of new contacts that are coming in?
A whole bunch of new people.
Fantastic.
I've made so many new mates just from VL1. People on Twitter and so on I didn't know existed until after the day. And they're all great guys. It's been fantastic.
And one of the things which seemed to work really well was that you're able to go around different games and you're able to see what's happening. So I think, like a lot of virtual gaming, we've talked about things like Kriegspiel before. We've talked about role playing. All four of us did your role play probably about a month ago now, set in the Wild West in Lardville, and we've all been in virtual Kriegspiels. But what was interesting was this was most definitely a set of figure war games. I mean, that's one point to emphasise, that people had all their terrain and their toys on the table. They were playing figure war games. So with 80 people, there's going to be quite a few games, aren't there? At all different locations throughout the world.
At the moment, Virtual Lard 2 has got 8 games. I'm expecting at least another 2 or 3 at the very least. So I think it does have the legs to get quite large.
Mm-hmm.
What I think is interesting is that, you know, my view of doing stuff like this at the outset of the lockdown is that, okay, well, we'll do it because we can't do anything else. But I think as we come out of lockdown, it would be a good idea to keep doing this, maybe in an annual event or twice a year.
If you're in Australia, a good example, Australia, or if you're in Canada, somewhere which is, you know, geographically distant from the United Kingdom, you might be in a part of that country where there may not be a lot of gamers in your locality as well. So a virtual event like this really does create the opportunity for people to participate. You mentioned Dave in Kansas City. And Kansas City is, you know, kind of Midwest, middle of Missouri, isn't it, really, I think? And that's a good way to go to the East Coast, good way to go to the West Coast. There may not be that many gamers in the locality of somebody in Dave's position. So having an event like this would be a good idea, not just in the times of lockdown, but to save money and just to save the hassle of traveling as well.
Yeah, when I started this, my initial thought was there's zero barrier to entry. So if the 3 games we put on Tank, the worst you've lost out on is a couple of hours of playing some Lardy games, which can never really be that bad. It's not cost anybody anything, and you'll never do it again. But it's definitely worked, and I always thought, well, maybe this will just be something for lockdown, scratch the itch. It'll never replace a proper Lardy Games Day, because even right now, I don't think you can ever recreate a proper Lardy Games Day virtually. And I thought when lockdown ends, this would end. But chatting to the guys in the pub afterwards, there very much was that sense of perhaps we do this once a year or twice a year as an international day. And I think that could work.
Yeah, I feel really positive about it. I mean, I honestly thought, well, that pub, the games might work, but the pub can't. But it really did. I mean, it really did. It was like, you know, we were having a drink with, you know, guys in Pretoria down in South Africa. We were having a drink with guys in Australia, having a drink with guys in America, guys in Scotland, and all over the UK. And it felt like you were in a pub with your mates. And I didn't have to put my hand in my pocket once and buy him a drink, which was even better. You'd have loved it, Sid.
And there was a fantastic range of international beer being consumed. So it was almost like a beer festival as well by the guys in Bavaria. The guys in Bavaria were drinking all kinds of stuff. And Dave in Kansas, you know, he was... I don't know if he lives next door to a gasoline station, but I think by the end of the night he was he was on the 4-star. So it was a really great event. So, you know, I think it was hats off to you, Jeremy, for devising and being the, you know, the creative force that brought that into being. Because I think it's going to, the evil mastermind. That's it. Because I do think it's going to stay with us. I think it's going to be a great thing for the community, and I think you've done a great service to many wargamers who have been stuck at home during lockdown. So I doff my virtual hat to you, sir, for making this happen and making it happen in the name of Lard, which is even better. And it just reinforces where the community is going all the time. It's fantastic to hear this kind of stuff. So hats off to you for that. Guys, what else would you say? Sydney, what else would you have to add to this? We're making him feel good now, so be nice.
Well, I could just say exactly the same thing, because I generally do feel all of that. One thing I did, which I think we're keen to do on the show, is give messages for people who may be tempted to give it a go in their own regard. And that's what we did with the Kriegspiel show, sort of giving people information about, you know, how they might go about online Kriegspieling. And of course, Virtual Lard, big event, VL2, maybe even bigger. But people can do the same activity, game with friends, and it doesn't need to be a huge Lard event. They can just do it in a small group, and we've seen lots of instances of that. So what tips would you give us, Jeremy, if for anyone who's listening, to try and replicate an online game using terrain, using figures? I mean, you mentioned about the 2 cameras. Any other sort of tips that you came across that you think are good advice?
Well, what I have done on the Discord server, and it's open to all, so if you want to join, send me an email. But I've created a couple of audio and video channels that anybody can use if they want to put on their own virtual games in between the virtual Lardy days. So if they don't want to use Zoom or something like that, they could use the Discord camera and set it up there. Join the server, and then just start asking questions. We've got a number of very experienced organizers in the likes of John Savage and Charlie Walker, who are more than happy to answer all your questions, give you all the tips they've learned the hard way, and just give it a go. It's very much a different role from playing a game in that you're the organizer, so you don't really have a vested interest in the game. So you really have to play for both sides. And that's quite hard work, because you end up giving what you think could be choices of strategy, or how you see the battlefield. So you're constantly thinking. So it's a very different cap to wear from your normal game. But it's fantastic. I encourage everybody to give it a go.
And where can people log on to the Discord server? Because that's still up and running, I believe.
It's still up and running, yes. So if they email me at virtuallard, or one word, at gmail.com, I will send them a link, and they just register and they can start talking to people and using all the facilities. I've left all the pub tables open if people want to have a couple of virtual drinks, or even use them for paint and chat sessions. It's almost become like a little mini community, which is great.
Excellent.
That is brilliant. That is brilliant. So I could just go on there and go to the Leipzig table, where I think I left half a pint of unfinished bitter. And I could go and sit there while I'm painting, and if anybody else could come and join me.
Correct.
Sounds like my kind of pub.
Make sure your camera's not on, Rich.
Right, where's it? What's this thing you're going to do, Nicholas? I think you've got a little surprise for young Jeremy, haven't you?
We have got a surprise for young Jeremy, which may or may not work. So now, having lured him on here under the pretext of talking about Virtual Lard, we're going to try a new segment on the show, which we thought would be a bit of fun. So it's a bit of a question and answer session. It's based on a theme that we've stolen from a TV show, which I won't name just in case they come and steal it, in case they take us to court. But we're going to ask you the questions, and for you to answer the questions in as fast a time as you can get. There are 20 questions that I've got on these cards. They're shuffled and they're randomised. And in fact, if you'd like to, I don't know if you can hear the cards. I don't know if you can hear that. They're sort of going through. If you want to say, tell me when, and I'll cut the pack.
When?
I'll cut the pack. Okay.
I've got my stopwatch ready.
Yeah, so we're going to see how there. I'm going to ask you the first 20 questions. Okay, you've got to answer them as quickly as you can. If you pass on any of them, we will add 5 seconds to your score.
Ooh.
Yeah. So we want answers. They're not going to tax you too much, but will give us a bit of an insight into you, the man behind the facade, as well. So are you up for this, Jeremy? Have any questions before we get started on the Lardish Inquisition?
No, let's go for it.
Okay, are you ready, Rich? To start the clock.
I've got stopwatch in hand.
Okay.
Jeremy, your time starts now.
Favourite book on wargaming or history?
Donald Featherston's one.
Last figure that you brought?
Bought or brought?
Bought. Purchased.
Beastmen of a Deacon.
Name of your last wargaming opponent?
Oh, Jamie Tattersall, my mate in Berry.
What paints do you use?
Vallejo.
Favourite colour paint?
Oh, blue.
What do you hate painting most of all?
Civilians.
Last wargame, win or lose?
Infamy, lost.
Lager or bitter?
Lager.
Short and fat or long and thin?
Short and fat.
Favourite battle?
The Persian Gates, 300.
Plastic or metal?
Metal.
Dinner date, Rich, Nick or Sid?
Sid.
Yes.
Coffee or tea? Coffee or tea?
Coffee in the morning, but mostly tea.
Attack or defend?
Attack.
Fried or scrambled?
Fried.
What period do you have the most figures for?
Probably horse and musket.
Win at all costs or be polite?
Be polite.
Favourite wargame show?
Probably Vatnatek.
Ooh.
Black pudding or beans?
Black pudding every time.
What period would you love to play but don't?
ACW, I used to play it, got out of it, but I'd like to get back into it again.
Stop the
Sold
clock.
all my army.
Stop the clock. Right, we've got our first man. Our first name on the leaderboard will be Jeremy.
1 minute 51.
1 minute.
0.02 seconds.
1 minute 51.02 seconds will be the time to beat if this makes it to the show and if we ever do it again.
If you're in Australia, a good example, Australia, or if you're in Canada, somewhere which is geographically distant from the United Kingdom, you might be in a part of that country where there may not be a lot of gamers in your locality as well. So a virtual event like this really does create the opportunity for people to participate. You mentioned Dave in Kansas City. Kansas City is kind of Midwest, middle of Missouri, isn't it, really, I think? And that's a good way to go to the East Coast, good way to go to the West Coast. There may not be that many gamers in the locality of somebody in Dave's position. So having an event like this would be a good idea, not just in the times of lockdown, but to save money and just to save the hassle of traveling as well.
Yeah, when I started this, my initial thought was there's zero barrier to entry. So if the 3 games we put on tank, the worst you've lost out on is a couple of hours of playing some Lardy games, which can never really be that bad. It's not cost anybody anything, and you'll never do it again. But it's definitely worked, and I always thought, well, maybe this will just be something for lockdown, scratch the itch. It'll never replace a proper Lardy Games Day, because even right now, I don't think you can ever recreate a proper Lardy Games Day virtually. And I thought when lockdown ends, this would end. But chatting to the guys in the pub afterwards, there very much was that sense of perhaps we do this once a year or twice a year as an international day. And I think that could work.
Yeah, I feel really positive about it. I mean, I honestly thought, well, that pub, the games might work, but the pub can't. But it really did. I mean, it really did. It was like, we were having a drink with, guys in Pretoria down in South Africa. We were having a drink with guys in Australia, having a drink with guys in America, guys in Scotland, and all over the UK. And it felt like you were in a pub with your mates. And I didn't have to put my hand in my pocket once and buy him a drink, which was even better. You'd have loved it, Sid.
And there was a fantastic range of international beer being consumed. So it was almost like a beer festival as well by the guys in Bavaria. The guys in Bavaria were drinking all kinds of stuff. And Dave in Kansas, he was... I don't know if he lives next door to a gasoline station, but I think by the end of the night he was he was on the 4-star. So it was a really great event. So I think it was hats off to you, Jeremy, for devising and being the creative force that brought that into being. Because I think it's going to, the evil mastermind. That's it. Because I do think it's going to stay with us. I think it's going to be a great thing for the community, and I think you've done a great service to many wargamers who have been stuck at home during lockdown. So I doff my virtual hat to you, sir, for making this happen and making it happen in the name of Lard, which is even better. And it just reinforces where the community is going all the time. It's fantastic to hear this kind of stuff. So hats off to you for that, guys. What else would you say, Sydney? What else would you have to add to this? We're making him feel good now, so be nice.
Well, I could just say exactly the same thing, because I genuinely do feel all of that. One thing I did, which I think we're keen to do on the show, is give messages for people who may be tempted to give it a go in their own regard. And that's what we did with the Kriegspiel show, sort of giving people information about, how they might go about online Kriegspieling. And of course, Virtual Lard, big event, VL2, maybe even bigger. But people can do the same activity, game with friends, and it doesn't need to be a huge Lard event. They can just do it in a small group, and we've seen lots of instances of that. So what tips would you give us, Jeremy, for anyone who's listening, to try and replicate an online game using terrain, using figures? I mean, you mentioned about the 2 cameras. Any other sort of tips that you came across that you think are good advice?
Well, what I have done on the Discord server, and it's open to all. So if you want to join, send me an email. But I've created a couple of audio and video channels that anybody can use if they want to put on their own virtual games in between the virtual Lardy days. So if they don't want to use Zoom or something like that, they could use the Discord camera and set it up there. Join the server, and then just start asking questions. We've got a number of very experienced organizers in the likes of John Savage and Charlie Walker, who are more than happy to answer all your questions, give you all the tips they've learned the hard way, and just give it a go. It's very much a different role from playing a game in that you're the organizer, so you don't really have a vested interest in the game. So you really have to play for both sides. And that's quite hard work because you end up giving what you think could be choices of strategy or how you see the battlefield. So you're constantly thinking. So it's a very different cap to wear from your normal game. But it's fantastic. I encourage everybody to give it a go.
And where can people log on to the Discord server? Because that's still up and running, I believe.
It's still up and running, yes. So if they email me at virtuallard, or one word, at gmail.com, I will send them a link and they just register and they can start talking to people and using all the facilities. I've left all the pub tables open if people want to have a couple of virtual drinks or even use them for paint and chat sessions. It's almost become like a little mini community, which is great.
Excellent.
That is brilliant. That is brilliant. So I could just go on there and go to the Leipzig table where I think I left half a pint of unfinished bitter. And I could go and sit there and, while I'm painting, and if anybody else could come and join me.
Correct.
Sounds like my kind of pub.
Make sure your
camera's not on, Rich.
Right, what's this thing you're going to do, Nicholas? I think you've got a little surprise for young Jeremy, haven't you?
We have got a surprise for young Jeremy, which may or may not work. So now, having lured him on here under the pretext of talking about Virtual Lard, we're going to try a new segment on the show, which we thought would be a bit of fun. So it's a bit of a question and answer session. It's based on a theme that we've stolen from a TV show, which I won't name just in case they come and steal it, in case they take us to court. But we're going to ask you the questions, and for you to answer the questions in as fast a time as you can get. There are 20 questions that I've got on these cards. They're shuffled and they're randomised. And in fact, if you'd like to, I don't know if you can hear the cards. I don't know if you can hear that. If you want to say, tell me when, and I'll cut the pack.
When?
I'll cut the pack. Okay.
I've got my stopwatch ready.
Yeah, so we're going to see how there. I'm going to ask you the first 20 questions. Okay, you've got to answer them as quickly as you can. If you pass on any of them, we will add 5 seconds to your score.
Ooh.
Yeah. So we want answers. They're not going to tax you too much, but will give us a bit of an insight into you, the man behind the facade, as well. So are you up for this, Jeremy? You have any questions before we get started on the Lardish Inquisition?
No, let's go for it.
Okay, are you ready, Rich? To start the clock.
I've got stopwatch in hand.
Okay.
Jeremy, your time starts now.
Favourite book on wargaming or history?
Donald Featherston's one.
Last figure that you brought?
Bought or brought?
Bought. Purchased.
Beastman of a Deacon.
Name of your last wargaming opponent?
Oh, Jamie Tattersall, my mate in Berry.
What paints do you use?
Vallejo.
Favourite colour paint?
Oh, blue.
What do you hate painting most of all?
Civilians.
Last wargame, win or lose?
Infamy, lost.
Lager or bitter?
Lager.
Short and fat or long and thin?
Short and fat.
Favourite battle?
The Persian Gates, 300.
Plastic or metal?
Metal.
Dinner date, Rich, Nick or Sid?
Sid.
Yes.
Coffee or tea? Coffee or tea?
Coffee in the morning, but mostly tea.
Attack or defend?
Attack.
Fried or scrambled?
Fried.
What period do you have the most figures for?
Probably horse and musket.
Win at all costs or be polite?
Be polite.
Favourite wargame show?
Probably Vatnatek.
Ooh.
Black pudding or beans?
Black pudding every time.
What period would you love to play but don't?
ACW, I used to play it, got out of it, but I'd like to get back into it again.
Stop the
Sold
clock.
all my army.
Stop the clock. Right, we've got our first man. Our first name on the leaderboard will be Jeremy.
1 minute 51.
1 minute.
2 seconds.
1 minute 51.02 seconds will be the time to beat if this makes it to the show and if we ever do it again.
Biggest, some
I
big.
think the chances of that are pretty remote.
It's just the kind of thing we need. Right, thank you, Jeremy. Sydney, do you want to take us out of here, Compare Man?
I can. I hardly know what to say after that. I'm looking forward to our dinner date. I'm thinking of the suitable restaurant as we speak. But all we have to say now, Jeremy, look, you've been a fantastic friend to all of us. You've been a brilliant host at Virtual Lard. It's great fun to see you virtually. I know we're all desperately disappointed that we haven't been able to hook up in person and buy you a drink and enjoy your company. But on that note, I think it's probably time to say goodnight. So from Jeremy, Richard, Nick, if we all say goodnight. Good night, everyone.
We're not saying goodnight. It's not the end of the programme, you knobhead.
Oh, we're just going back into the rest of the
We're
show.
going back into the... That's right.
Well,
That's
good
right.
night.
Thank you, guys.
See you after the break.
See you after the break then.
Sydney Roundward. He's got red trousers.
And we're back. And after that tour of Virtual Lard and discussion with good friend of the Lard, Jeremy, it's time for our big issue. And rather than think about points relating to gaming, which we've done before, we're going to think about ways of actually setting up the table, and in particular, what makes good terrain, and probably inspired a little bit about what we were talking about previously, relating to the footprint of terrain on a Wargames table. And we've all seen many tables at different scales and different periods, different types of rules as well. And the terrain isn't accidental, which goes together to make a really good wargame. The terrain is an integral part of making sure that the game flows and possibly even that the rules work well. So what I wanted to talk about today is what we think are really good ways of setting up Wargames terrain, not having too much, but also not having too little, having something which catches the eye, but also something which doesn't over-dominate the game, something which is appropriate, if you like. And I know both of you guys, we've talked about this almost every time we play, but certainly we've talked about it a little bit on the Oddcast, but I'm not sure that we really got to the heart of some of the thoughts that we've had over the years. So going to you first, Rich, how about a few thoughts on the type of terrain that you can see being used, for example, the game of the moment in Infamy?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the big issue with terrain and designing a Wargames table is that you need to have terrain that reflects the region that the game is set in. I remember when I was a kid, most Wargames tables, when you were playing American Civil War battles, most Wargames tables tended to look like Kent or Surrey, because in those days we used like the HO airfix buildings, and the only ones that were really available was that very English church, and the farm had a classic thatched farmhouse, and the other half timbered sort of big manor house, and the Waterloo farmhouse, which you would split into 3 different buildings to try and multi-purpose, and it looked ridiculous in most of those roles. So trying to get terrain to look like the area that you're fighting in, I think, is important, but also you have to ask a question: do you want the terrain to dominate the table, or don't you? Because in some situations you do. Now, for example, if you're fighting in the Teutoburger Wald in Germany, where you've got Varus and his legions being attacked by the barbarians from the woods, or if you're talking about the Brigantes as Agricola is advancing north through northern Britain, that terrain you do want to be dark and foreboding and relatively close and dominating the table. So in Infamy, when you're dicing up your terrain, you'll find a lot more woods and a lot more chance of forest in Germany than you will in Gaul. And I think that's right, because it's there to try and reflect what's there. If you are not reflecting the terrain, you're not reflecting the tactical situation that troops will find themselves in. But there is, of course, a balance there, and it depends on issues such as ground scale. So, for example, if you're fighting a skirmish game, it's very important that your buildings are, the relevant scale for the figures that you're using, or the relevant ground scale. And it's important, you want them to have windows where they would have windows, and doors where they would have doors. Houses have a front door and a back door normally, and if the model you've got doesn't have a back door, that actually is implausible. The other thing is, to counter that, you can have a situation whereby if you're fighting a game with a battalion is 24 figures or whatever, you probably don't want to have buildings that are of the same scale as the figures, because that building would represent something the size of Wembley Stadium. So it's a case of trying to strike a balance. And what we were talking about with the smaller footprint that Charles Grant used and that you're using with those Dutch buildings is very much about trying to make the built-up area take up the space that the built-up area would take historically, because your lace wars, or whatever, flouncy wars, or whatever it is you do, that's not one-to-one figure scale, is it, Sid?
No, it's not. No, it's not at all. It's 1 to 30, 1 to 33, or 1 to 20, or something like that.
Right.
I mean, we've had so many games over the years that we've played in that we ourselves are completely guilty in this. I mean, I certainly have. Where we've sat at the table and we've had a nice piece of terrain to place on the table. Yeah. So I remember us doing a game of, I think it was Duxbridge a few years ago. So I got that very large Roman villa that I made. And because one had made it and it was really nice, and we thought, well, we put it on the table, and it's quite a small table. And the Roman villa takes up about 1.5 foot square, at least. It completely dominates the game. So there can really only be one game, which is capture the villa. And I think if you expand it forward and you're trying to do a legionary action, you're really capturing a small town like, I don't know, Colchester or St Albans, if you put that on the table. And I think trying to think about any game, there's a couple of things, aren't there, Nick? I mean, we've thought about before, and this is relevant for your thinking about Arnhem, what's the actual effect of the terrain in the battle, or the type of battle that you're trying to reflect? What's the effect which you're trying to create in the war game? And then thinking, well, how do you best achieve that, as opposed to just using all the terrain that you've got, or the best, or the favourite terrain you've got? What are you trying to achieve relating to the footprint of the terrain, which doesn't impede the action? And I think that's something which we've talked about with your Arnhem games.
Yeah, and with Arnhem, there are some particular challenges around the Dutch countryside that challenge most wargamers, because most wargamers don't have Dutch-style terrain in their collections. So what do we mean by that? Well, we've got lots of ditches or particular types of buildings, or canals, and the whole thing around that is just different when you go to Holland. And one of the things that's really challenged me when we've been trying to recreate the historical locations of actions in Market Garden and turn them onto the tabletop is how practical is it for most gamers to produce this terrain. Because, so for instance, if you look at the actions, I'm going to murder the pronunciation of this, Jasper, so please, apologies, I'm sure you'll text me about it. But if you look at the lock at Heuven, which is near Mook on the southwestern edge of Nijmegen, across the canal there. So there's a lock there, and it's a rather curious table layout, because in theory what you've got is a canal with a lock, and that goes into a wider emptying basin, and the Americans are attacking across this lock, and attacking some Germans that are on an island in the middle of the canal. So if you take that terrain and you take the aerial photo and you create that in a scale that fits on your chain of command table, you then have the challenge of most gamers could not recreate that table using their existing collection. You'd have to be quite specialist to actually want to work out how to do that, and that's always a challenge. So it's really easy to do games that are around a farmhouse or a crossroads or an attack on a prepared position, a hilltop or whatever. But when you get to some of these really interesting, more nuanced games, the creation of the terrain can be a big headache, but it can also be one of the most rewarding aspects of it as well. Of course, you can really put some energy and effort into it to get it what you want it to look like, and it's really been interesting to study, particularly, as I say, the Holland actions, the Dutch battlefields, to look at that and to try and get that to the point where we can create something that people can put on the tabletop and game. And now with that particular action, there's not a lot you can do other than present the way it looks and say, well, okay, you might have a challenge with doing this, but I tell you now, you're going to have an interesting game if you can get it right. But I agree with everything you guys have said about what the influence terrain has. I remember a game that I played, I think it was in Cardiff, where some guy decided that the building that he was in was the wrong way round, because it had windows on the side that he didn't want them to be on. And he'd much prefer the windows to be on the other side, because that's the side he wanted to shoot out of. So he turned the bloody building round. And he, I'm sure history is full of events where people have loved to turn the building round to give it a different direction, for instance. That kind of stuff's really important. And the other thing on this as well is churches. Churches are lovely buildings, and model churches are beautiful. How often do you see a model church which comes in at a footprint that is monstrous when it comes to what the actual table looks like? And they're beautiful pieces of terrain, and for the right level of game. So if you're gaming the attack on where the eagle has landed, and you want to game the attack on the church, you want a nice big church. But if it isn't the centerpiece, does it really matter? Surely you want something smaller. Rich, you want to say something?
Yeah, Laporte. Do you remember the Laporte game?
Yes.
We did
yes.
Salute, I think. That was great. I mean, that church was colossal. I can't remember how much space it took up, but it was huge. I got it from the United States. I can't remember the details of it, but it was, I guess it was about 2 foot, because of course it's built in the shape of a cross, so it's about 2 foot long and about 18 inches broad across the whatever you call it, and it was great. And it was great for that game because the church at Laporte was absolutely the centrepiece of the fight for that village on D-Day. But if you just wanted it on the table as an incidental piece of terrain, it's so huge, as Sid was saying, any game would turn into Battle for the Church because of the size of it.
Yeah. And that's really interesting, isn't it? Because then, what do you use if you don't want to focus on? Do you accept the fact that you're going to use a much smaller church, or how do you play that out? Because it makes a difference, doesn't it? The churches are big. Churches are big places. You go to Normandy, so St Mary Église, it is a big church. Laporte, big church. Even I saw some guy, I think, is it Adam from Sweden, who's doing the church at Saint Marie du Mont, and he's doing that in 28mm. It's about 3 feet long. Yeah,
it's colossal and very ornate. The spire.
Beautiful model.
A crazy spire, but a very interesting village as well. So,
I think one of the things that is interesting when you're making terrain is that elements like churches, small forts, fortified locations, factories, they require a lot of model making skill to create. So you're going to take time over it, and you're going to want to have to use it. The Roman villa is another good example.
Yeah.
And they do have, as you sort of mentioned, they do have a real impact in the actual battles that we're trying to recreate, or the type of battles. The thing which I think is often interesting, though, is when you're reading accounts, and it doesn't really matter if it's an account of a big battle or it's an account of a skirmish, is those elements of micro-terrain which have a disproportionately large impact. It's the stream which isn't visible, which runs dry. It's the fold in the ground. It's the inability to locate a particular site over open sites between two woods. It's those sort of elements which make a huge difference on the battlefield. Just like a large church, which is the centerfold of the game, but the micro terrain is just as important. And that's something that is always interesting to model, because it doesn't require a big thing on the table. But that can sometimes really be the turning point, which, again, going back to previous podcasts, you really get the feeling from by walking the battlefield, Rich.
Yeah, look at the Dutch fences, Nicholas. Those garden fences on the Utrechtsweg.
Yeah, it's a classic example, isn't it, really?
They're wire fences. They give no cover whatsoever. They don't break line of sight, so there's no advantage in being behind them. But they are very difficult for men to get across when they're carrying all their kit. And those fences, even I now could probably vault across one relatively easily after 10 pints of lager. But when you're encumbered with a Lee Enfield rifle and you're carrying 60 pounds of kit, you can't do that. And that there were countless references to those fences. Even Urquhart mentions them in his account, saying how the fences. It was the fences what won it.
That's what it was. That's what it all goes down to. None of this talk about Jim Gavin. It's the fence. And the other thing on that made me think about terrain while we're on this, Sid. I know you wanted to come in, so I hope I'm not going to steer the conversation off of your point. I'm sure you'll come back to it. Is hills in games as well? It's certainly in skirmish games. I saw somebody on Twitter the other day asking why we don't see more hills. And of course, I don't. In a skirmish game, you don't necessarily get a hill. You don't get the up and the down of a hill in a skirmish game. You get curves of the earth. But what I think we should see more in our games is a slope. I think we don't see enough slopes in games. I think slopes, from one end to the other, makes a really interesting dynamic to a game. And instead of having a game which is just a flat table, if you lift one end up by 3 inches somehow, you've got a different kind of question about visibility and dominance. What dominates then is really quite important.
It's very, very difficult to model that. You're quite right. If you're playing ACW and you've got 24 figures as a battalion and you want to have little round top or whatever, you can. It's a foot round or whatever, and there it is on the table as your bit of terrain. But in a skirmish game where the table is 250 yards by 160 yards or whatever it is, hills take up more space than that. So what you are getting is, as you say, a slope in the ground, and modelling that's incredibly difficult.
Yeah, I think it's very hard because your trees are always going to go straight up generally. So if you lift by 3 or 4 inches, your trees are growing at an angle. Yeah. I think hills are one thing. I mean, most war games have hills or have used hills. They tend to be hills which often are not that realistic when you go around the Chilterns where we live, or you go around any sort of rural area in the southeast of England or the south of England. Yeah. Hills do not just spring up and then disappear. They're not really sort of that mogul type of hill. But trying to model the effect of hills, I think, is important. And it's difficult to actually know what difference they make. When you go back to the Creechby rules, where you're penalised by going down a hill because you're losing control, as opposed to getting a classic sort of charge bonus as you might have done in WRG 6th edition, and going up a hill. Well, is that a disadvantage, or is that actually something which assists with control? As you're going under there, you're less likely to lose control. So I think trying to model hills is a really interesting exercise. Depicting them on the war games table in a realistic fashion is difficult, although there are lots of different ways that we can try and think about that by identifying where the slope starts.
Yeah, I think that the real issue there is, imagine that I've got a table in chain of command, and one end of it is 20 feet higher than the other end. But actually, in truth, that the way we model hills in wargaming is we tend to have very visible start points and end points. The slope begins there and then ends within 2 inches of it, and then you have a plateau on top. So if you actually put on the table, having half the table being one contour level higher than the other half of the table, you get an unnatural sort of break line where half the table's higher than the other half, and that reflects contour lines on a map, but it doesn't reflect what the terrain actually is, because that slope is gentle and barely noticeable when you're walking on it, but when you're at the top of it or at the bottom of it, there's a big difference between what you can see. And it's how we model that, or more to the point, how we fail to model that, that's an important point.
I think that's the thing. So you go to Normandy, imagine you're walking around behind Utah Beach somewhere. You've got Hill 20, right? It's 20. It's called Hill 20. It's tiny, but actually you can notice it if you're standing at the bottom of Hill 20 and you look across it. You can see that whoever's on the top of that hill behind that hedgerow is going to be out of line of sight of you. And this is the thing. What I was just sitting here listening to you guys and thinking about how we represent these things in war games, and my mind goes back many years. What I don't think we see so much in war games rules these days, or in writing about war games, are things about dead zones and lines of visibility. We don't see. Remember the lines you used to get in any war games rules? It would have like a line going out from an artillery battery, and it would go over a hill, and it would say that this village can't be seen, but these troops can, or this part. We don't tend to see that so much now, do we? It's kind of something I think which has worked its way out of the hobby. Maybe that's because of the way we model hills, but we don't tend to think very much about dead ground so much these days.
Oh, I see what you mean.
Do you know what I mean? Yeah. In the games that we play.
I see what you mean. You're talking about if you have a look at a side-on view of a hill, and the artillery would have a dead zone on the rear slope of the hill because it couldn't. The shell naturally has to follow a curve. Yeah. And you're right. You used to get that a lot in rules, didn't you?
Yeah. And these. So it's something I think that the likes of Donald Featherstone and Charles Grant. I mean, Henry will be down in his chair at this point, telling us exactly what books that they've done this in. But we don't tend to see that so much now in modern war games rules, and maybe that's because the table we're looking at a smaller battlefield, and or we've got different ways of modelling it. That's I think those two factors both combine probably.
Yeah, I think that's an really excellent point. So you've got a compatibility there, haven't you, between the actual tactics of the time and how earlier war games rules writers reflected that. So rear slopes are critically important when the other side either has abundant scouts or they've got artillery which can engage in some sort at long range. So rear slopes really become important. Hiding your force and being able to manoeuvre it in a way which isn't seen by the other force is critically important. But I think you put your finger right on the point that over the years we've often, a lot of us, not all of us, but a lot of us have become very comfortable with a 6x4 table or a 8x4 table, but something which is quite contained. And if we're gaming in 28mm and that large skirmish style, we may have a hill line which is often at the edge of the table. We may have one or two hills in the middle of the table which tend to be small, but we don't have that central hill creating dead ground, because that then becomes a bit like the church. It becomes the magnet for the action. And actually thinking about how we deploy terrain to possibly create that area of dead ground is a real art in itself, Rich.
We did have that in the Boer War rules when we were doing that, because when your artillery are firing up onto Spion Kop, there are definitely going to be dead areas of ground. But we don't have it in chain of command, and I think the reason we don't have it in chain of command is exactly what we've been talking about. The piece of real estate we're fighting over is that much smaller.
Yeah, it's a compromise, isn't it? If we had a sand table, and you could make rolling terrain on a sand table, you could absolutely make whatever type of terrain you wanted, but we don't have that. most of us these days are working on a gaming mat, which goes onto a flat surface, on top of which we put other stuff. And, you know, so therefore we create the best games we can based on the models and toys that are available to us to do that. And what that means is that we're really good at doing some things, so we can create, you know, a lovely churchyard with lots of clutter and loads of detail because we've got the ability to do that. But some of those rolling terrain we still struggle with.
Yeah, so it's a really good point. Actually, the way that we create tables has changed. But you might remember at the club, apologies for people listening, but my old lounge carpet had a lot of offcuts. So we used my old lounge carpet at the club for about a good 10 years to create stepped, really quite neatly graduated but gently stepped combinations of amounts of carpet.
And with a sheet over the top to smooth it.
An old-fashioned sheet over the top. And that gave some really interesting contouring and dead ground. And then, of course, we, quotes, progressed, unquotes, to the sort of gaming mats and the terrain boards which interlocked and all the other things that we've lost that. So it's interesting, yeah.
So and I want to go back to that particular terrain because one of the most effective games I think we ever played with that was we did some water tanker campaigns in the Western Desert, if you remember, Rich. Using 15 mil on a, what was it, 6x5 table.
Yeah,
honeys and pop twos. Yeah, with rolling terrain on the set, and it was that's when you did get this idea of dead ground and using gullies and, you know, the whole repertoire of tank combat, I guess, comes into play because you're able to create the conditions that you can use that weapon of war in its best light. You can apply the tactics of the time in a way that you can't do on some other tables. So terrain is a crucial part in allowing us to recreate the fighting. And if we get the terrain right, we're more likely to get the rest of the action right.
Well, that's been a terrific discussion. Thank you very much for that. We've got one of the things which we can have in lockdown is these discussions, which we can then turn to reality when we all come out of lockdown, unless we're playing on a solo basis. But that's possibly all we've got time for on the big issue at this point. But that doesn't mean to say that we're just going to vanish into the ether, because we have a couple of announcements, I think, because on the 25th of July, Jeremy, who we heard from earlier in the Oddcast, is staging Virtual Lard 2, which is another Virtual Lard gaming event. Virtual Lard 1 was terrific, as we heard earlier. Virtual Lard 2, I think, is probably going to be slightly larger, maybe even substantially larger, and it's bound to be another great event. So the inquiries for Virtual Lard 2 are to Jeremy at virtuallard@gmail.com. And Jeremy can be found on Twitter as well. So anything which you want to inquire relating to Virtual Lard 2, Jeremy is your person for that. And I think that's actually possibly our only announcement. I don't think we've got another announcement.
I think it's worth saying that people might be starting to come out of lockdown now and starting to think about how they can come together. So if anybody knows of anything, we'd love to hear about that. If there's any Lard events that you're planning to get us out of lockdown, then please share them with us. And if you're doing online things as well, I think I hear that some of the shows might be going online later in the year. So we should keep an ear out for what happens there too.
Terrific. Well, that's all we've got time for in this evening's show. So I'd like to say to both my friends here, Richard Clark, Nick Skinner, thank you very much for the show. And thank you, everyone, to listening. I hope you have a very good evening and a really pleasant rest of the weekend.
In tonight's show, Sidney Roundwood was joined by Nick Skinner and Richard Clark, with music by Roger Barraclough and his band.